There is a photograph, taken sometime in the early autumn of 1957, that historians of the electronics industry return to again and again. 8 men in dark suits, arranged in 2 loose rows, staring at the camera with the practiced discomfort of people who did not enjoy being photographed. Their names, if you read them off left to right, mean almost nothing to the general public even now, but say them slowly, in the right room, to the right person, an engineer who has spent a career inside the machines these men made possible, and watch what happens. Julius Blank, Victor Grinich, Jean Hoerni, Eugene Kleiner, Jay Last, Gordon Moore, Robert Noyce, Sheldon Roberts, 8 men. And the reason that photograph matters, the reason it has been reproduced in textbooks and museum placards and documentary films for more than 60 years, is that these 8 men had just done something that, in 1957, was very close to unthinkable. They had all quit the same job on the same day. They had walked out on the man who hired them, a man widely regarded as the most brilliant mind in their entire field, a Nobel laureate in waiting, the co-inventor of the device at the heart of the modern world. And in doing so, without any of them fully understanding it at the time, they lit the fuse on Silicon Valley. The company they left behind is remembered mostly as a footnote. The company they built, Fairchild Semiconductor, is remembered as something closer to a genesis, because nearly every major semiconductor firm that came afterward can trace a line, sometimes a single hop, sometimes several, back to that building in Mountain View, California. Intel came out of Fairchild, AMD came out of Fairchild, National Semiconductor, Signetics, Intersil, dozens upon dozens of companies, so many that the men who left Fairchild to start them earned their own nickname. The Fairchildren, an entire industry budding off one root, and it all begins with a betrayal, or a rebellion, depending on how you tell it, and with 8 signatures on a single sheet of paper. This is a channel about the companies that built the electronic world, told the way the engineers who built them would want it told. Down to the circuit board, down to the part number, down to the specific afternoon in a specific laboratory when someone figured out the thing no one else had figured out. We are less interested in the executives who took the credit than in the people at the bench who did the work, and we try, wherever the history is genuinely disputed, to hold both facts at once rather than flatten a complicated story into a hero and a villain, because the truth is almost always more interesting than the legend, if that is the kind of thing you want more of. Subscribe now, because this archive is still being built, and there are a great many companies left to tell. To understand why 8 men would walk out on the most famous physicist in America, you have to go back further than 1957. You have to go back to a night in December of 1947 at Bell Telephone Laboratories in Murray Hill, New Jersey, where 3 researchers, John Bardeen, Walter Brattain, and William Shockley, had been chasing a way to amplify an electrical signal using a sliver of semiconducting material instead of a fragile, power-hungry vacuum tube. On the 23rd of that month, Bardeen and Brattain pressed 2 gold contacts, spaced impossibly close together, against a small crystal of germanium, and watched a signal grow. They had built the first working transistor. It was an ugly thing, a lump of plastic and metal and wire that looked like something assembled from spare parts, and it would go on to become the single most manufactured object in human history. Shockley, who had led the group but had not been in the room for that first demonstration, was reportedly furious to have missed it. He was a difficult and driven man, ferociously intelligent, and he did not intend to be a footnote in the story of his own invention. Over the following weeks, he retreated and worked almost obsessively, and by early 1948, he had designed a fundamentally better device. The junction transistor, a sandwich of semiconductor layers that was far more practical to manufacture than the delicate point contact original. History would give the 3 men a shared Nobel Prize in 1956, but Shockley wanted more than a prize. He wanted a company. He wanted to be the man who turned the transistor into an industry and, in the process, became rich. So in 1955, he left Bell Labs and went home. Home being Palo Alto, California, where his mother still lived, a quiet town of apricot orchards and a well-regarded university that had not yet lent its region a nickname. There, with backing from an inventor and industrialist named Arnold Beckman, he set up Shockley Semiconductor Laboratory, and he began recruiting. And here is the thing that makes the whole story turn. Shockley was a genuinely great talent scout. He could not hold on to the established stars of the field. Many of the senior people who knew him would not come work for him because they knew what he was like. So instead, he went after the young. He combed the best physics and engineering programs in the country and hired brilliant men in their 20s and early 30s, people with fresh doctorates and enormous ability, and crucially, no reputations yet to protect. He was, in effect, assembling one of the finest collections of young semiconductor talent ever gathered in one place. And he did it, in part, by dangling his own fame To work for Shockley in 1956 was to work for a legend. Among the men he brought west was a physical chemist from Iowa named Gordon Moore. Quiet, precise, methodical, the sort of person who measured twice and spoke once. There was Jean Hoerni, a Swiss-born theoretician with 2 doctorates and a mind that ran to the elegant and the abstract. There was J. Last, an optics specialist out of MIT, Sheldon Roberts, a metallurgist, Victor Grinich, an electrical engineer, Julius Blank and Eugene Kleiner, both mechanical engineers who could actually build the equipment the work required. And there was a physicist from Grinnell, Iowa, a charismatic, easygoing man with a gift for explaining hard ideas in plain language, a natural leader who put people at ease almost without trying. His name was Robert Noyce, and he would come to matter enormously. For a few months in 1956, it felt like the beginning of something extraordinary, and in a sense it was. Just not the something Shockley imagined. The lab occupied a plain commercial building at 391 South San Antonio Road in Mountain View, a former storefront that had once, fittingly enough, housed a fruit packing operation. The men set up benches, ordered furnaces and diffusion equipment, and began the painstaking work of learning to make silicon do what they wanted. They were young, most of them newly married, most of them transplanted from the East Coast and the Midwest to a valley that still smelled of blossoms in spring, and they had come across the country to build the future for the most famous name in their field. And within a year, nearly all of them wanted out. The problem was Shockley himself. The traits that had made him a great physicist, the certainty, the relentlessness, the conviction that he saw further than anyone in the room, curdled when he became a manager into something corrosive. He was suspicious. He posted salaries on the wall. He second-guessed his people's work and then took credit for what went right. There is a story, told often since, that when a secretary cut her hand on a broken thumbtack, Shockley became convinced someone had sabotaged it deliberately and ordered lie detector tests for the staff. Whether the pin was truly sharpened by malice or simply broken by accident hardly mattered. What mattered was that the man who ran the lab believed his own employees might be conspiring against him and was willing to hook them up to a polygraph to find out. You can read the episode as paranoia, and most of the men who lived through it did, but you can also read it as the behavior of someone under enormous pressure, a Nobel-caliber mind who had staked his reputation and his fortune on a company that was not shipping product, watching the schedule slip, while the people he had personally recruited grew quietly mutinous. Honest history holds both. The men were being driven away, and the man driving them away was also drowning. There was a technical fracture underneath the personal one, and it mattered just as much. Shockley, restless and brilliant, had become fixated on a more exotic device, a 4-layer diode, a switching component he was convinced would be a breakthrough, and he steered the lab's energy toward it. Several of his young engineers thought this was exactly the wrong bet. The silicon transistor, they believed, was the real prize. There was a whole industry waiting to be built on it, and the lab was wandering away from it into a research thicket. So the disagreement was not only about a difficult boss, it was about the future, about which piece of silicon was going to matter and whether the company they had crossed the country to join was aimed at it or away from it. In the spring of 1957, a group of them decided the boss had to go, not the companies, the boss. Gordon Moore, Jean Hoerni, J. Last, Sheldon Roberts, Victor Grinich, Julius Blank, and Eugene Kleiner quietly reached out to Beckman, the industrialist who was footing the bills, and made a discreet case. Keep the lab, keep the mission, move Shockley into some elevated advisory role where his genius could help and his temperament could not hurt. For a moment, it looked as though Beckman might agree. Then he didn't. Beckman, weighing the reputational cost of pushing aside a Nobel laureate against the complaints of a handful of unknown 20-somethings, sided with Shockley. And that decision, reasonable enough from where Beckman sat, sealed everything that followed. The 7 men now understood that nothing was going to change. They were trapped in a lab run by a man they could not work for, on a project they did not believe in, with no path to fix it from inside. What they lacked was a leader the rest of them would follow, and someone to raise the money. Because in 1957, the idea of a group of salaried engineers simply walking out to start their own semiconductor company was close to unthinkable. Companies were founded by financiers and industrialists, not by the men at the benches. But the 7 had someone in mind. They went to Robert Noyce, who, notably, had not been part of the early plotting, because he was in some ways Shockley's favorite, the one the boss most admired, and they asked him to come with them. Noyce hesitated. He liked Shockley. He owed him something, and leaving felt to a young man raised in the Midwest uncomfortably close to disloyalty. He went home and thought about it, and the next morning he told them yes. With Noyce in, they were eight men with doctorates and mortgages and no capital, about to do something no one had a template for. The person who found them, their template was Eugene Kleiner, the mechanical engineer, whose father happened to have an account with a New York investment bank. Kleiner wrote a letter, a plain, earnest letter explaining that a group of experienced men wanted to leave together and build silicon transistors, and asking whether anyone might be interested in funding such a thing. The letter landed on the desk of a young financier named Arthur Rock, and Rock, reading it, understood something that most of Wall Street did not yet grasp, that the value here was not a factory or a patent portfolio, but the 8 men themselves, their knowledge, sitting in their heads, portable, ready to walk. Rock and his partner shopped the group around to roughly 36 established corporations, asking each one to bankroll a new venture built around this team. Every single one said no. The concept of investing in people rather than plant, of backing a startup founded by its own engineers, was simply not how business was done in 1957. Then Rock thought of a man named Sherman Fairchild, an inventor's son, an heir, the largest individual shareholder in IBM, a bon vivant with money and curiosity, and an aircraft and camera company on the East Coast called Fairchild Camera and Instrument. Sherman Fairchild had a taste for new technology and the capital to indulge it, and when the proposition reached him, he did the thing no one else would. He said yes. The deal that resulted was, by the standards of the day, a strange hybrid. Not quite a purchase, not quite a partnership. Fairchild Camera and Instrument would put up the money, roughly $1.5 million, to launch a new subsidiary called Fairchild Semiconductor. The 8 men would each own founders' stock, but written into the arrangement was a clause that would matter enormously later. Fairchild Camera held an option to buy out the founders entirely, to purchase all their shares for a fixed sum, $3 million, and fold the semiconductor operation completely into the parent company. In 1957, that clause looked like a formality, a bit of corporate housekeeping. The engineers signed it without much thought. They were not thinking about exit prices. They were thinking about silicon. And so, in the last months of 1957, 8 men who a year earlier had never imagined running anything opened a rented building in Mountain View, California, a few miles from the lab they had fled, and began to build a company from nothing. There was no equipment, there were no processes. There was a concrete floor and empty benches, and the accumulated knowledge in 8 skulls, which was, as it turned out, exactly the asset Arthur Rock had bet on. Gordon Moore later remembered the almost comic poverty of those first weeks, that they had to build their own diffusion furnaces because they could not buy what they needed, that they scavenged, that Hoerni sketched process ideas on scraps, and the mechanically minded ones translated them into apparatus with their hands. Julius Blank and Eugene Kleiner, the two with real shop instincts, tooled up a manufacturing line more or less by improvisation. Victor Grinich handled the instrumentation. Sheldon Roberts worked the metallurgy of the silicon crystals. J. Last took the photographic and optical side, and presiding over all of it, loosely, without ever quite claiming the title, was Robert Noyce, the man the other 7 had gone home to fetch, the one whose easy charisma and physical fearlessness made him the leader they had lacked at Shockley's bench. What they had come together to make was, at first, one specific thing, a silicon transistor for a specific customer. The Mesa transistor, they called it because of its shape, a raised plateau of semiconductor left standing after the surrounding material had been etched away, the active junction perched on top of the mesa like a building on a butte. It was double diffused, meaning 2 successive diffusions of impurities into a slice of silicon created the layered structure, emitter, base, collector, that made the thing amplify. Their first real order came from IBM, which wanted the transistors for the memory drivers of a navigation computer aboard the B-70 bomber, an aircraft being built for the U.S. Air Force. IBM would pay $150 per transistor, a fortune per device, but the volumes were small and the military tolerances were unforgiving. Fairchild shipped its first 100 units in the summer of 1958. The little company had a product, a customer, and revenue, all inside its first year, which for a semiconductor firm built from an empty room was close to a miracle. But the Mesa transistor had a flaw, and the flaw would drive one of the 2 inventions that made Fairchild immortal. The exposed junction on top of the Mesa was vulnerable. Contaminants could settle on it. Worse, engineers testing the devices discovered that tiny loose particles inside the transistor's sealed can, flecks of metal, specks of debris, could bridge across the junction and short it out. There was a grim, half-joking test at Fairchild in those days. Tap a transistor sharply, listen for a rattle, and if it failed after the tap, you knew a particle had moved. Devices bound for a bomber's navigation computer could not fail because someone bumped a workbench. The reliability problem was existential. The man who solved it was John Hoerni, the Swiss-born physicist with 2 doctorates, one of the quietest and most abstract minds in the group. Hoerni had actually conceived the idea a year earlier and written it into a notebook, and had it witnessed and dated, a habit that would matter, but had set it aside while the Mesa work took priority. Now, with reliability threatening everything, he returned to it. His insight was to stop building the junction up into a fragile mesa, and instead to leave the surface of the silicon flat, protecting the delicate junctions beneath a grown layer of silicon dioxide. Glass, essentially, the same stuff as a window, formed right on the chip. The junctions would be sealed under that oxide, buried, shielded from every particle and contaminant. Hoerni called it the planar process, from the Latin for flat, and when the first planar transistors were tested, they were not merely a little better than the Mesa devices. They were dramatically, almost unbelievably more reliable. Orders of magnitude fewer failures. The oxide layer that everyone else in the industry had regarded as a nuisance to be etched away, Hoerni had turned into the transistor's armor. The planar process was, quietly, one of the most important inventions of the 20th century, though almost no one outside the field knows Hoerni's name. It did something beyond making a better transistor. Because the surface stayed flat and the oxide sealed everything, you could now imagine putting more than one device on a single flat slab of silicon. You could imagine laying down components side by side and connecting them without wires, printing the connections right onto the oxide in a film of metal. Hoerni had been trying to solve a reliability problem for a bomber. What he had actually done was hand his colleagues the physical foundation for the integrated circuit. And at almost exactly the moment his flat transistors were proving themselves, another Fairchild man was standing in front of a chalkboard, staring at the problem of how to wire a whole circuit together without wires at all. A problem that a man in Dallas, at a company called Texas Instruments, was wrestling with at the very same time, which would set up one of the great contested credits in the history of technology. But that reckoning comes later. For now, the two threads, Hoerni's flat, sealed silicon and Robert Noyce's restless mind, were about to braid together into the single most consequential object the company would ever make. Robert Noyce was not, in the strict sense, the group's most gifted physicist. Hoerni was more rigorous, more systematic, more meticulous with a photolithographic mask. What Noyce had was a rarer thing, the ability to hold the whole picture at once, to see across the boundaries that separated one man's problem from another's. He had grown up in Grinnell, Iowa, the son of a Congregationalist minister, and he moved through the lab with a Midwestern ease that could disarm a room, a man who flew his own plane and sang madrigals and talked to a junior technician the same way he talked to an Air Force general. He had been the one who called Sherman Fairchild in the first place. Now, in the early months of 1959, he was thinking about a problem that had nothing directly to do with reliability and everything to do with the future. The problem was called the tyranny of numbers, and it was strangling the entire electronics industry. As circuits grew more ambitious, as engineers dreamed of computers with thousands of components, the components themselves had shrunk beautifully, but the wires between them had not. Every transistor, every resistor, every capacitor still had to be connected to its neighbors by hand, by a soldered wire, by a human being with tweezers and a steady hand and a magnifier. A complex circuit might require tens of thousands of these connections, and each connection was a place where a solder joint could crack, where a wire could come loose, where the whole assembly could fail. The military wanted circuits with hundreds of thousands of components. Nobody could physically wire them. The industry had a name for the wall it was hitting, and the wall was made of solder. In Dallas, at Texas Instruments, an engineer named Jack Kilby had already had his own answer to the tyranny of numbers. That summer of 1958, alone in the lab during a company vacation he had not yet earned the seniority to take, Kilby had built a working circuit, a phase shift oscillator, entirely out of a single piece of germanium, transistor and resistor and capacitor all carved from one material. It worked. When he switched it on in front of the executives on September 12, 1958, a green line rolled across the oscilloscope, unbroken, and the men in the room understood they were looking at something that changed everything. Kilby had proven the idea. A circuit could be monolithic, made from one block. Honest history holds this firmly. Jack Kilby built the first working integrated circuit, and he built it first, and he would one day receive the Nobel Prize for it. But Kilby's circuit had a flaw that was not a flaw of concept, but of execution, and it was the same flaw Noyce would solve. Kilby's components sat on their block of germanium, but the connections between them were still made with tiny flying wires, thin gold threads bonded by hand from one part to the next, arching over the surface like the wires of a suspension bridge. He had eliminated the separate components. He had not yet eliminated the wires. His integrated circuit was a proof that the thing could exist. It was not yet a thing that could be manufactured 1,000,000 times over. And this is where Hoerni's flat-sealed silicon re-entered the story, because Noyce, thinking about the tyranny of numbers in the Mountain View lab in January of 1959, was standing on a foundation Kilby did not have. Kilby had worked in germanium with a mesa-style surface. Noyce worked in a world where John Hoerni had already made the surface of silicon flat and covered it in an insulating layer of glass. And Noyce looked at that flat, glass-covered surface and saw not armor, but a canvas. If the whole top of the chip was already sealed under oxide, and the oxide was an insulator, then you could open little windows in the oxide precisely where you wanted to touch the silicon beneath. And everywhere else the metal would simply ride harmlessly over the glass. You would not need flying wires at all. You could evaporate a film of aluminum across the entire surface, etch it into the exact pattern of connections you wanted, and the oxide would keep those metal lines from shorting into the silicon anywhere you had not deliberately opened a window. The wiring would be printed. The wiring would be part of the chip. It is one of those ideas that sounds obvious the instant it is spoken and was invisible to almost everyone until it was spoken. The tyranny of numbers had held because everyone assumed a wire was a wire. A physical, three-dimensional thing you attached. Noyce, building on Hoerni's planar process, dissolved the wire into a photographic step. The connections became just another mask, just another layer, laid down in the same batch, in the same afternoon, as the transistors themselves. There was no separate wiring stage at all. You could put 10 components on the chip or 10,000. The labor was identical because you were printing, not soldering. The wall of solder simply ceased to exist. Noyce sketched it into his own lab notebook on January 23, 1959, and had it witnessed and dated, that same careful habit that ran through the whole company like a nervous tick. Because these men, having watched Shockley claim their work, understood that a dated notebook was a kind of armor too. Fairchild filed its patent that summer. Texas Instruments had filed on Kilby's version earlier, and so the two companies, and the two men, and the two fundamentally different objects, Kilby's monolithic circuit with its flying wires, Noyce's planar circuit with its printed connections, collided in the patent office and in the courts, and the fight over who invented the integrated circuit would grind on for the better part of a decade. You can read this two ways, and honest history holds both. Read one way, Kilby was first, unambiguously, months ahead, with a working device on an oscilloscope while Noyce was still drawing. The concept of the monolithic circuit is his, and the Nobel Committee agreed. Read the other way, the integrated circuit that actually conquered the world, the one that could be manufactured in the millions, the one whose descendant is in the phone in your hand, is Noyce's planar version, the one that killed the flying wire and made the whole thing printable. Kilby had the idea first. Noyce had the idea you could build 1,000,000,000 times. Both are true. The engineers involved understood this better than the lawyers did, and the two men, to their lasting credit, spoke of each other for the rest of their lives with a plain, unforced respect, as two people who had climbed the same mountain from different faces and met, more or less, at the top. In 1966, the companies settled into cross-licensing, agreeing to share the royalties on a thing that neither could quite claim alone. The patent war ended not with a winner, but with an acknowledgement that the invention was too large to belong to one hand. But that was later. In 1959, what mattered inside Fairchild's building on Charleston Road was that they now had, in principle, a way to make an entire circuit as a single object, and in practice, almost nothing worked yet. The gap between a notebook sketch and a shippable part is a canyon, and it fell to a different set of hands to walk it across. This is the part of the story the popular histories skip because it is unglamorous, and it is slow, and it is where the real labor lived. A young engineer named J. Last was given the job of turning Noyce's concept into an actual manufacturable device, and he assembled a small team and disappeared into the problem of it. The problem of isolating the components from one another on a single slab of silicon that, being a semiconductor, wanted to conduct current in every direction at once, because that was the catch nobody mentions when they tell the clean version. A single crystal of silicon is not a blank breadboard. Put two transistors on the same chip, and left alone, they are electrically connected through the bulk of the material beneath them, leaking current into each other, ruining everything. Kilby had solved this crudely, by etching motes and running his flying wires over the gaps. Noyce's printed wiring only worked if you could somehow build electrical fences down inside the silicon, walls of reverse bias junction that would keep each component in its own pen. Last's team spent the better part of 2 years on it, on diffusion schedules, on etch depths, on the maddening business of cutting isolation trenches and backfilling them, on yields that hovered near zero, and then, on a good week, near a few percent. They tried an approach where they etched all the way through a thin wafer and glued it to a backing, and it was ungainly and it half worked, and they kept at it because half working was infinitely more than not working. The first true integrated circuit to come out of that grind was a simple thing by any modern measure: a flip-flop, a single logic element, 4 transistors, and a handful of resistors printed together on one sliver of silicon, the metal interconnect running over Hoerni's oxide exactly as Noyce had drawn it. Fairchild put it on the market in 1961 under a plain catalog designation, and it cost around $120 for that one modest circuit, which in the money of the day was a small fortune for something that did so little. The discrete version, the same logic built from individual transistors and resistors soldered by hand, cost a fraction of that. On pure economics, the integrated circuit was, at birth, a ridiculous product. It did less and cost more. This is the thing to hold on to. The object that would remake the century arrived on the market as a bad deal, and almost the only customers who would touch it were the 2 customers who did not care what it cost: the missile program and the space program, who needed circuits that were small and light and did not fail, and who would pay nearly anything to get them. So the Minuteman missile's guidance computer took the early chips, and then the Apollo guidance computer took them by the tens of thousands, and for a few years the entire American integrated circuit industry was effectively funded by the government's need to put small, reliable brains inside things that flew very fast toward the sky. It is worth sitting with that, because the romance of Silicon Valley likes to imagine the chip as a pure product of garage genius and free markets, and the truth is that the free market wanted nothing to do with it at first. It was the defense budget and the moon that bought the integrated circuit its childhood, that paid for the yields to climb and the prices to fall, until, around the middle of the decade, a chip finally cost less than the pile of discrete parts it replaced, and the whole logic of electronics tipped over, all at once, into the future. And when it tipped, Fairchild was standing exactly where the money would fall. By the mid-1960s, the company that had begun with 8 men and a check from a camera and instrument conglomerate had become the technical center of gravity for the entire industry. Its process, Hoerni's planar method, Noyce's printed interconnect, Moore's relentless discipline about yield and cost, was simply how integrated circuits were made, everywhere, by everyone, because everyone else was learning it from Fairchild, often by hiring people who had learned it at Fairchild. The company ran what amounted to the finest graduate school in semiconductor manufacturing that had ever existed, and it did not fully understand that this was a liability as much as an asset. Gordon Moore, running the R&D lab, watched his engineers turn discovery after discovery into product, and in 1965, an editor at a trade magazine asked him to write something predicting where the field was going, and Moore sat down and did a little arithmetic on the number of components he had managed to cram onto a chip year over year, and noticed that it had been roughly doubling every year like clockwork, and that there was no reason it should stop. He wrote it up almost casually, a few pages, a hand-drawn graph on semi-log paper, and predicted that this doubling would continue for at least a decade, putting perhaps 65,000 components on a single chip by 1975. It was a throwaway observation in a 4-page article, and it would come to be called Moore's Law, and it would function for the next half-century less as a description of nature than as a shared deadline the whole industry agreed to keep, a promise the engineers made to themselves, and then spent 50 years straining to honor. But that is the legacy talking, and the legacy was still years away, because in 1965, Moore was writing his little article inside a company that was, quietly and from the top, beginning to come apart. The problem was never the technology. The problem was that Fairchild Semiconductor did not belong to the men who ran it. It belonged to Fairchild Camera and Instrument, back on Long Island, and the parent company took the enormous profits the California division was throwing off and spent them on other things, on ventures that had nothing to do with silicon, on a corporate culture that regarded its brilliant Western subsidiary as a cash register rather than a crown jewel. Noyce, running the operation, had no equity to hand out, no stock options to keep a 28-year-old process wizard from walking across the valley to a startup that would make him rich. And by the mid-60s, there were startups everywhere, and every one of them was staffed, top to bottom, with people who had learned the trade at Fairchild. The graduate school was graduating its faculty. You can read what happened next 2 ways, and honest history holds both. The first reading is a tragedy of ownership. that a distant parent company, by refusing to share the wealth its engineers created, guaranteed that those engineers would leave to create wealth for themselves, and that Fairchild's decline was the entirely predictable price of treating irreplaceable people as line items. The second reading is almost the opposite, and it is more generous to everyone involved, that no company on earth could have contained what Fairchild had accidentally assembled, that when you gather that much talent in one building and teach it that anything is possible, the building cannot hold it, and the leaving is not a failure of management, but a law of physics. The same restlessness that made the 8 walk out of Shockley's lab in the first place, now propagating outward, generation after generation, exactly as it was designed to. Both readings are true. The company was mismanaged from 3,000 miles away, and it was also simply too full of the future to stay in one place. So they left, the way they had arrived, in a group, on their own terms. In the summer of 1968, Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore, the two men who had held the technical soul of the company together for a decade, resigned. They were not children this time. They were among the most respected men in American technology, and they raised their money in an afternoon on the strength of their names alone. They called the new company Intel for Integrated Electronics, and they took with them a young Fairchild chemist named Andrew Grove, who would run it with a discipline that made Moore's yield sermons look gentle. And behind them the dam broke completely. Fairchild's departed engineers founded, or seeded, so many companies that people began, half-joking, to call them the Fairchildren, advanced micro devices, founded by the Fairchild sales director Jerry Sanders and 7 others in that same restless spirit of 8. National Semiconductor, remade by Fairchild refugees. Intersil and Signetics before them, and dozens more, until someone counted and found that, of the roughly 90 semiconductor firms that existed in America by the early 1970s, more than half could trace their founding, or their founders, directly back to that one building on Charleston Road. The genealogy of Silicon Valley is not a metaphor. It is a family tree, and Fairchild is the trunk. And here is the thing the artifact in the glass case cannot quite tell you on its own. Fairchild Semiconductor did not die the way Nokia died, or the way Palm died. There was no single humiliating collapse. No brand sold off to a foreign manufacturer in a footnote. It simply hollowed out. It kept making chips competently for decades. It was bought and sold and spun off and eventually swallowed in 2016 by another semiconductor company for about $2.5 billion, a respectable sum and a rounding error next to the trillions of dollars of value that walked out its doors in the persons of the men who left. That is the strangest fall in all of technology history. A company that lost everything by succeeding so completely that its success could not be contained. It did not fail to build the future. It built too much of it and could not keep any of it home. Walk through the Computer History Museum in Mountain View today, a few miles from where the plant stood, and you will find the relics under glass. One of Hoerni's planar transistors, one of Noyce's first monolithic integrated circuits, a wafer of gray silicon scattered with the tiny bright rectangles that started all of it. They look like nothing. They look like scraps of foil, like something you'd sweep off a workbench. But hold in your mind what they became. The chip that the free market didn't want, that only the moon would pay for, is now inside the phone in your pocket, the car in your driveway, the pacemaker, the satellite, the machine you are watching this on. Billions of transistors where Noyce fit 4, all of them descended in process and in principle from that one flat, dust-proofed idea. And it lives there under 1,000 brand names, on every continent, in every device on Earth. Every brand, except, in the end, the one that invented it. The 8 men who walked out of Shockley's lab to escape a difficult boss ended up building not a company, but an entire way of building companies. And the valley they left behind still runs on the same restless logic they set in motion, that the best people will always leave to build the next thing, and that this is not the sickness of the place, but its whole engine. So we want to hear from you. If you ever held one of these, a Fairchild chip, a UA741 op-amp, an early Intel part, anything with that lineage soldered onto a board you built, tell us the part number, the year, and what you made with it. And tell us this, because we genuinely wonder, was Fairchild's undoing a failure of ownership, or was it simply the price of gathering that much genius in one room? Which reading do you hold? The people who use these parts know more than any earnings report ever could.